Millions of fans have watched the record stand for over 50 years. 17 wins, 0 losses, the only perfect season in NFL history, and every single year since, the surviving members of the 1972 Miami Dolphins pop champagne the moment the league's last undefeated team finally loses. But perfection on the field never meant protection off it. Dementia, spinal cord injuries, a safety who fell down a staircase. This is where the only team to ever go all the way without a blemish really ended up. One is the middle linebacker who anchored Miami's famous no-name defense, and whose off-field mission became more important than anything he ever did between the lines. Nick Buoniconti was a 5-time All-Pro who won 2 Super Bowls with the Dolphins after 7 seasons with the Boston Patriots, undersized at 5 feet 11 and dismissed by scouts before proving, according to nearly everyone who coached him, to be the smartest defender on the field. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1940 to an Italian baker, Buoniconti starred at Notre Dame before going on to a law degree and a second career as a player's agent and broadcaster after football. In 1985, his son Mark, a linebacker at the Citadel, suffered a spinal cord injury during a college game that left him permanently paralyzed from the neck down. Buoniconti flew to his son's hospital bedside and promised him he would spend the rest of his life trying to help him walk again, co-founding the Miami Project to cure paralysis, which has since raised nearly $500 million for spinal cord and brain injury research. Buoniconti had been knocked unconscious and diagnosed with a concussion at least 10 times during his own career, once saying he barely remembered playing in Super Bowl VI at all. By his early 70s, he began falling and losing his memory. At 74, doctors diagnosed him with dementia, and he agreed to donate his own brain to Boston University upon his death, honoring the same research mission he had built for his son. Nick Buoniconti died on July 30, 2019, at age 78, after years of being unable to walk, read, or care for himself, from what researchers determined was almost certainly chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The anchor of the no-name defense spent his career being the smartest man on the field. Nick Buoniconti spent his final years unable to remember the perfect season at all, having given every dollar he could raise to a disease that wasn't even the one that killed him. 2 is the bruising fullback whose punishing running style defined an era of football, and who somehow became the one who got to watch nearly everyone else go first. Larry Csonka rushed for over 1,000 yards in each of Miami's 3 Super Bowl seasons, earning Super Bowl VIII MVP honors and becoming, according to his own offensive line, the best back they ever saw at turning a 2-yard gain into a 5-yard one by refusing to go down on first contact. Born in Stowe, Ohio in 1946 and raised on his family's farm, Csonka was an All-American at Syracuse before Miami made him the 8th overall pick in 1968, and coach Don Shula personally re-engineered his running style, teaching him to lead with his forearm instead of his head to survive the punishment he absorbed running straight through the heart of opposing defenses. He briefly left football for the rival World Football League in 1974 before returning to a Hall of Fame induction in 1987. Unlike most of his teammates from that perfect season, Csonka avoided the sport's worst outcomes, building a long second career as an outdoorsman and television host, including his own show, and remaining a fixture at Dolphins reunions and Hall of Fame ceremonies. He is alive today in his late 70s, one of the dwindling number of players from the 17-0 team still able to show up in person. Every year the record survives another season. Csonka ran through linebackers for a decade, using his own body as the weapon. Larry Csonka is one of the few members of the only perfect team in NFL history still standing to watch the champagne get poured. If Buoniconti's story is the one that got you, tell me in the comments which member of this perfect team hit you hardest, because the next man on this list died only 1 month later. The second Hall of Famer from that same offense lost within a matter of weeks. 3 is the center who anchored the perfect season's offensive line from the very middle of the field, and whose death arrived so close behind his own teammates that the Hall of Fame flag had barely gone back up. Jim Langer went from an undrafted free agent cut by the Cleveland Browns to the starting center of the only perfect team in NFL history, taking over the job in the 1972 preseason and playing every single offensive snap of Super Bowl VII. Born in Little Falls, Minnesota in 1948, Langer played linebacker at South Dakota State before Miami converted him to center, and he went on to start 128 consecutive games, earn 4 All-Pro selections, and become a first-ballot Hall of Fame inductee in 1987, a path the Hall's own president later called an inspiration built entirely on perseverance. Langer settled back home in Minnesota after football, and in 2013 became one of the few members of that championship team to publicly decline an invitation to the White House, telling a reporter he didn't want to sit in a room pretending to enjoy himself, given what he called serious moral compass issues in Washington at the time, a stance he stood by even knowing it would upset people. On August 29, 2019, Jim Langer died of a sudden heart-related problem at a hospital near his home in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, at age 71, exactly 1 month after his teammate Nick Buoniconti passed away, and only months after their mutual friend and fellow offensive lineman, Bob Kuechenberg, had also died. Langer was the rock in the middle of one of the greatest offensive lines in NFL history. Jim Langer went from a player nobody drafted to a bronze bust in Canton, then became the second Hall of Famer from that same championship roster lost within a single summer. If Langer's story is the one that got you, tell me in the comments which member of this perfect team hit you hardest, because the next man on this list only played 1 game for that championship season, and the disease that killed him decades later turned out to be one of the worst cases science had ever documented. 4 is the veteran backup quarterback who stepped in for exactly 1 perfect game and whose autopsy became one of the most severe CTE diagnoses ever recorded in a former NFL player. Earl Morrall was 38 years old during the 1972 season, a 17-year veteran and former league MVP with the Colts, who had been signed by Miami as insurance behind starter Bob Grease. When Grease broke his leg and dislocated his ankle in Week 5, Morrall stepped in and led the Dolphins to 9 straight wins, keeping the perfect season alive before Grease returned for the playoffs. Born in Muskegon, Michigan in 1934, Morrall had already thrown for a Super Bowl appearance with Baltimore before Miami's coaches praised him as the steadiest, most professional quarterback either had ever coached. After retirement, Morrall served as a high school athletic director and city commissioner in Florida, well-liked and well-remembered by nearly everyone in the small football world he stayed close to. He died in 2014 at age 79. The following year, researchers at Boston University examined his donated brain and determined he had suffered from stage 4 chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the most severe classification the disease has, among the worst cases ever documented at the time. Morrall started only 9 games during the perfect season, but they were 9 of the 17 wins that made the record possible. Earl Morrall's brain turned out to be carrying the single most advanced case of CTE found in any player from that undefeated team, discovered only after it was far too late to ask him what it had felt like. 5 is the free safety who intercepted 5 passes during the perfect season and helped seal it with Super Bowl VII's game-clinching pick, and whose death nearly 50 years later had nothing to do with football at all. Jake Scott was named Super Bowl VII MVP for the Dolphins' 14-7 win over Washington that completed the perfect season, forming what many considered the best safety tandem in football alongside Dick Anderson, a hard-nosed, famously private player who reportedly skipped the team's White House visit because he didn't feel like going. Born in Detroit in 1945 and raised largely in Georgia, Scott played college football at Georgia before an unusual detour through the Canadian Football League, arriving in Miami as a 5th-round pick who became one of the most feared ball hawks of his era. After football, Scott moved to Hawaii for years, largely avoiding the spotlight and reunions that his more famous teammates embraced, a private life that suited him. On March 18, 2020, while visiting friends in Atlanta, Jake Scott fell down a flight of stairs. He died from his injuries at age 75. Scott sealed the most perfect season in football history, with the ball still in his hands as the clock ran out. Jake Scott's own ending had nothing to do with the violence of the game he mastered. Just an ordinary staircase, decades after the hits had already stopped. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the man who built this entire perfect team and coached it with an iron jaw for 26 years is the last name on this list. 6 is the head coach who built the only perfect team professional football has ever produced, and who spent the rest of his life defending a record nobody has come close to touching. Don Shula coached the Dolphins to the 17-0 season in 1972 and a repeat championship the following year, retiring in 1995 as the winningest coach in NFL history with 347 total victories, a mark that still stands. Born in Grand River, Ohio in 1930, Shula played defensive back in the NFL for 7 seasons before beginning a coaching career that took him from the Baltimore Colts to Miami in 1970, where he introduced situational substitution and personnel packages that are now standard practice across the entire league. He coached 3 Hall of Fame quarterbacks in Johnny Unitas, Bob Grease, and Dan Marino, and personally reshaped Larry Csonka into a Hall of Fame runner. Every year that another team enters the season undefeated, Shula's surviving players famously gathered to celebrate, half in jest, whenever the streak eventually broke. A ritual Shula defended good-naturedly for decades, saying he'd gladly call to congratulate whoever finally matched it. In his own retirement, Shula devoted significant time and money to breast cancer research through the Don Shula Foundation, established in memory of his first wife, Dorothy, who died of the disease in 1991. Don Shula died peacefully at his home in Miami on May 4, 2020, at age 90. He had been hospitalized several times in his final years for fluid retention and sleep apnea, but by all accounts remained sharp and engaged with football until the very end. Shula built the single greatest coaching record the NFL has ever seen. Don Shula got to keep his mind, his memory, and his perfect season intact for 90 years, the one member of that entire championship organization who the game never seemed to send a bill to at all. They rest now in a Massachusetts family's hands, in a Minnesota hometown that named a high school football field after him, in a Michigan brain bank that recorded the worst case researchers had seen, and in an Atlanta hospital bed after an ordinary fall. One still shows up every year the record survives another season, refusing to go down easy even now. One got to keep everything the game gave him without it ever being taken back. The 1972 Dolphins are still the only team to ever finish a season with nothing to apologize for. And half a century later, the record is the only thing about that season that stayed perfect.